I always thought improvising over chord changes was hard, something you have to go to music school to really learn. But it turns out we can leverage the nature of the guitar fretboard itself to make it easy enough for any intermediate player to do. If you know the pentatonic scale, even in just one place on the fretboard, I want to show you a visualization technique that's a massive shortcut for improvisation. The technique is based on shifting pentatonic scale shapes from one string set to another, and it makes it surprisingly easy to play melodically over chord changes. In this video, I'll show you how to use this technique, how and why it works, and how to apply it to real chord progressions, even if you don't know much music theory. This visualization method has completely changed how I approach melodic soloing over chord progressions, and I hope it can do the same for you. Before we get into the details, we'll need to take a small step back to take a look at the big picture. When you're playing over chord changes, there are two primary approaches that capture what most guitarists do. Many guitar players base each solo on a single scale, typically pentatonic or one of the major scale modes. And the good players then add in target notes to sort of tag the chords as they go by. This is what most players think of when they hear the phrase chord tone soloing. And a lot of classic solos like Stairway to Heaven and Hotel California are based on that approach. But there's another approach that's closer to what many jazz players use, which I call one scale per chord. Basically, you switch scales to match the chord you're playing over. It sounds hard to do, but it doesn't have to be. Now, both of these approaches are well worth learning, and I cover them both step by step in my Improv 101 course, which is currently available to my gold level Patreon subscribers. And I want to thank them for their support. All paid Patreon subscribers at any level get the ebook that goes along with this video for free, as well as 2 backing tracks and exclusive animated practice videos. So check it out if you find this material useful. In this video, I'm going to focus on the one scale per chord method. It's not just for jazz, it's way easier than it seems, and it provides an easy answer to one of the most commonly asked questions about improvisation. How do you know what scale to play over a particular chord progression? The cool thing is that for many chord progressions with this method, you don't even have to ask that question. Instead of looking at the progression as a whole, you can just take it chord by chord. In many songs, you can play a minor pentatonic scale over the minor chords and a major pentatonic scale over the major chords. That might seem like it would be hard because most of the time when you change scales, you have to find a root node and remember which scale shape fits there. It's the whole caged system thing. But it turns out we can make that part insanely easy. Bear with me for just a little more background so this will all make sense. I promise it'll be worth it. It turns out that the major scale has 3 major pentatonic scales and 3 minor pentatonic scales hidden inside it. There are major pentatonic scales built on the 1st, 4th, and 5th scale degrees, and there are minor pentatonic scales built on the 2nd, 3rd, and 6th scale degrees. That means that for any given key, the 6 pentatonic scales you need to do this one scale per chord approach are already inside the major scale. And if your chord progression is built from any of the major scale modes, by playing the major pentatonic over major chords and the minor pentatonic over minor chords, you're actually playing exactly the right mode for the chord progression, just 5 notes at a time. And you don't even need to know what mode it is or how to play the whole scale. Let's look at this in the key of C major. In C, there are 3 major chords, the 1 chord C, the 4 chord F, and the 5 chord G. And there are C major, F major, and G major pentatonic scales inside the C major scale. There are also 3 minor chords and 3 minor pentatonic scales, D minor, which is the 2 chord, E minor, which is the 3, and A minor, which is the 6. Don't worry if you don't know the music theory behind this. You don't need to know it to use this approach. But it is worth knowing that these scales come in pairs, 1 major and 1 relative minor. The C major and A minor pentatonic scales share the exact same notes, as do F major and D minor, and finally so do G major and E minor. To visualize this on the fretboard, I think it helps to break down the 5 familiar pentatonic scale shapes using 2 smaller shapes that I call the rectangle and stack. You don't need to use my pentatonic system to use this scale shifting approach, but I think it makes it easier to visualize. It also makes it a lot easier to find the money notes when you solo. Every one of the 5 basic pentatonic fingering patterns is made up of rectangle and stack shapes. The rectangle is just 2 3-fret distances on adjacent strings, and the stack is just 3 2-fret intervals on adjacent strings. I draw the rectangles with a red border and the stacks with a blue outline so they're easy to see. Sometimes these shapes sort of fall off the edge of the fretboard, but if you think of them as forming a larger pattern that just alternates between rectangles and stacks vertically, you can easily play pentatonic scales on any fretboard. It works on 8-string guitars, it works on 6-string basses, basically any instrument that's tuned in fourths. Of course, the guitar itself isn't quite tuned in fourths. The interval between the G and B strings is a major third. And that quirk of the fretboard just means that whenever any geometric shape lies across this invisible boundary between the G and B strings, everything above that line just shifts one fret toward the bridge. I have a whole video on that if you don't already know how it works. You don't have to fully understand that to use this approach, but it helps. One more thing you need to know to get the most out of the rectangle and stack is where the roots are for the two pentatonic scales. In the rectangle, the minor root is the lower note on the upper string, and the major root is the upper note. In the stack, the major root is the lower note on the top string, and the minor root is the upper note on the middle string. That means that if you can find a root anywhere on the fretboard, you can place either a rectangle or stack there and build out the rest of the pentatonic scale shape from there. And here's where the breakthrough happens. If you go back to the major scale and you place the roots of the 6 pentatonic scales on the fretboard, you'll notice that they form a stacked pattern with the minor roots in one column and the major roots 3 frets higher. This pattern holds for all 12 keys. The roots for the 6 and 1 scales, in this case A minor and C major, are in the middle position. The roots for the 2 and 4 scales, in this case D minor and F major, are 1 string higher. And the roots for the 3 and 5 scales, E minor and G major, are 1 string lower. That means that if we were to place a rectangle here, we can play the A minor pentatonic scale by treating this note as the root, or the C major pentatonic by treating this one as the root. And if we want to play over the 2 chord or the 4 chord, we can just shift the whole shape up 1 string. Or if we want to play over the 3 chord or the 5 chord, we can just shift down a string. And this works exactly the same way for the stack. And because rectangles and stacks alternate vertically, this means that this shifting approach works for the full 6-string pentatonic shapes you probably already know. If you know the normal order of the pentatonic shapes on the fretboard, shifting up a string is like skipping over one pentatonic shape to the next. For example, starting on form 1 and skipping over form 5 to form 4. Shifting down a string is like skipping one going in the other direction. I find it a little bit counterintuitive to think about it that way. It's much easier to just visualize the rectangles and stacks moving up or down. So for every key, there's a family of pentatonic scales that you can play by shifting your patterns either up or down 1 string. If you're playing in standard tuning, you just have to watch out for the warp between the G and B strings. And that means that to solo over any chord in the key, you only need to be able to find one note on the fretboard by name, the root of the home key. And everything else is easy to find relative to that. I'll show you how to put this into practice over a real chord progression in just a minute, but to make great melodies using this system, it's helpful to know where the juicy target notes are inside the pentatonic scale. And the rectangle and stack shapes make this really easy too. If you're playing a major rectangle over a major chord, all 3 notes of the major triad are right there inside the rectangle shape. If you were playing the minor rectangle over a minor chord, your whole minor triad is right there as well. And the same thing is true in the stack. All 3 notes of the corresponding major and minor triads are right there in the shapes. I don't usually recommend memorizing anything, but memorizing these positions inside the rectangle and stack is the easiest way to find all the juicy target notes when you're using this 1 scale per chord approach to solo over a progression. And flipping from major to minor only changes 1 note in each, so they're easy to remember. The hardest part of using this whole system is knowing what function each chord in the progression is playing so that you know which way to shift the pentatonic scale. And I'm going to give you an easy zero music theory way to do that works for a lot of chord progressions. I'll show you how it works for a simple but super common progression, and then I'll show you how it works for Little Wing, which is slightly more complicated. Basically, we're going to go chord by chord through the progression and line up the minor chord roots 3 frets below the major chord roots. For this first example, the chord progression is D, A, B minor, and G. Let's place the D major root at the 12th fret of the D string. You can put it anywhere you can find a D note, but it's a good idea to start somewhere in the middle of the fretboard. We want to try to line up the major roots vertically, so the A major root would be the 12th fret of the A string. The minor roots should end up 3 frets lower, so we can put the B minor root at the 9th fret of the D string. And then finally, the G major root fits at the 12th fret of the G string. So in this chord progression, we'd treat D as the 1 chord, A as the 5, B minor as the 6, and G as the 4, just based on where they fall in this pattern. It doesn't always turn out that the key of the song lines up with the middle row, but if the song's based on the major scale or the natural minor scale, it will work out that way every time. Now, to use this approach to solo over this chord progression, we can start with any of the 5 pentatonic positions for D major. I'll demonstrate using form 1, which sits at the 7th fret. We'll treat this scale as being in the neutral position, and we'll use our major triad target notes over the D chord. When the chord changes to A, we'll shift down a string set and continue using the major triad target notes. In this position, shifting down gives us form 3. For the B minor chord, we'll shift back up to the neutral position, but we'll use the minor target notes. And then finally, when the chord changes to G, we'll shift up a string set and go back to the major triad targets. In this case, we'll be playing form 4. And if you do that, you automatically get melodic solos that nail the chord changes. For this example, you're playing the full D major scale, but you're doing it 5 notes at a time, which has the benefit of making your lines sound more vocal and less like playing scales. Here's an example along with an animation showing the shifts. Now let's apply this approach to a more challenging chord progression, Little Wing. First, we'll figure out how the chords relate to each other. Little Wing starts with an E minor chord, and we'll put that at the 7th fret of the A string, which gives us room on either side for the other chord roots. The G chord is major, so we'll look 3 frets higher, and it goes on the same string at the 10th fret. A minor fits at the 7th fret of the D string, B minor fits at the 7th fret of the E string. The B flat minor is a chromatic passing chord, so we'll ignore that. C major goes at the 10th fret of the D string. F major fits at the 10th fret of the G string. We'll come back to that one. And then finally, D major fits at the 10th fret of the E string. So we have our 3 parallel rows of chords plus 1 outlier. Now, bringing music theory back in for a moment, this song is in E minor, and if we reference everything back to the relative major scale, G major, then we figured out all of our chord functions just based on the location of this grid. The F chord doesn't fit into the G major scale, but that's okay. We can still use this approach. What I would do in this situation is just notice that F is 2 frets lower than the G that comes right before it in the chord progression. So when the chord shifts from G to F, I'd take whatever pattern I was playing and shift it down 2 frets. And for what it's worth, that's exactly what Hendrix did in his solo. So here are the 7th position pentatonic shapes for this song, and I'll animate them so you can see how they shift while the backing track plays. And I'll play a simple melodic solo that sticks completely to the pentatonic scales as shown. For what it's worth, this system has completely changed the way I approach melodic soloing. At first, it can seem like a lot of information to keep track of, but once you try it on a few chord progressions, you'll find that it gets pretty easy. I'm not suggesting that you should use this approach for every solo, but it's a really nice technique to have in your bag of tricks. If you found this useful, be sure to check out my full Improv 101 course, where I go even deeper into fretboard visualization and other improvisation techniques. It starts from the basics and builds everything up step by step. So if you can play a melody on the guitar, you can learn to improvise with my course. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions. And if this helped you, hit that like button and subscribe for more. If you're intrigued by what you saw here and you'd like a free overview of my system for mastering the fretboard with minimal memorization, check out this video. Thanks for watching.